Hey guys, if you're tuning in, you might want to go ahead and access, there's a link in the description of the prompt that we will be studying today. So if you want to take some time now to open that up, we'll read it in a few minutes, but if you want to go ahead and get that started, that'd be great. Hey guys, for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm excited to teach you a little bit about explaining argument. We'll start in about 2 minutes, about a minute and a half or so, but if you want to go ahead and access the prompt we'll be using, there's a link in the description underneath the video. So if you want to go ahead and pull that up, and then we'll get started in about a minute. All right, counting down the seconds, about to begin. One last call to pull up the prompt. And I just wanted to welcome you first, say thanks for being here. I'm assuming some of you, or the majority of you, are on your e-learning days, so thanks for coming to join us. Today we're going to talk about how argument demonstrates an understanding of an audience's beliefs, values, or needs. My name is Emily Velitis. I'm an AP English language teacher in Naperville, Illinois, at Naperville North High School. It's about an hour or so outside of Chicago. And I haven't seen my students in about a week and a half, so I'm happy to have other students, new students, to teach. So thank you for being here. All right, just to get us started, I wanted to explain a little bit about what will be happening over the next month. First, we'll be talking about units 8 and 9 from March 25th until April 7th. As you guys know, things have been crazy because of the pandemic, but colleges have asked AP students to study certain topics that still address units 8 and 9, and they're supporting all of these changes. They're being incredibly flexible, but in turn, they're asking us to make sure students are still learning the content. So we will be focusing on units 8 and 9 over the next 2 weeks. Think of it as though it's like a continuation of your existing learning. So what would you be learning if you were in the classroom? And the other thing I want to highlight is these are recursive skills. So even though 8 and 9 might not be explicitly assessed on the exam, they're recursive, meaning that they spiral and they're repetitive, and we keep seeing the same skills over and over again. So 8 and 9 are really about having a stronger understanding of how to read and break down a text, how to think through some issues, and then how to write and craft strong pieces of writing. So that's what we're really going to be addressing, and that can benefit you on the exam that you will see in about a month. To make it a little bit easier, though, we are going to be focusing more on the sophistication point, because units 8 and 9 are more, again, nuanced. They are more sophisticated. So we're going to approach the lessons through that lens. Then, in about a week or so, you will see a schedule be released of the topics that will be covered for review. Again, these are meant to be more like course review sessions than AP test prep. So we'll pick out some topics like introducing embedding evidence, understanding line of reasoning, things that we think are really essential and crucial to AP students. So you can kind of like pick and choose what you want to see or what you need to see, and tune into the lessons that you think would most benefit you. All right, so for today, again, we're going to look at how you can understand an audience's beliefs, values, or needs through the argument that's constructed. And if you're like my students, you are frustrated and dismayed by the sophistication row of the rhetorical analysis rubric. And you'll say it's like that unicorn point. It's so hard to earn and to achieve. And I definitely get that, and I understand that. One of the things that I think makes it so challenging is that one of the ways that you can earn it is if you explain the significance or relevance of the writer's rhetorical choices given the rhetorical situation. You can see here, because of that, you have to have a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. So a lot of students, if they are trying to contextualize, if they are trying to address the rhetorical situation, they tend to do it in very broad, sweeping, generalized ways, that it's not specific, it's not nuanced, it's not incredibly complex. So over the next week, we're really going to focus on one text, a pre-20th century text, and help you to first today identify the rhetorical situation and elevate it and make sure it's not just the basic, broad, generic understanding of the text. The piece that we're going to be reading, it's a really tough one. It's from the 18th century, and it was written by Abigail Adams. And before we get into how do you explain an argument and how it is revealing the audience's beliefs, values, or needs, we first have to identify the rhetorical situation. And when this prompt was given, that was the biggest mistake students made, that they could pull out certain things that they saw in the passage, but they struggled to relate it to the rhetorical situation. So that's our focus for today. Before we get started, I want you to think about a time in which a parent or a guardian or someone who's of an elevated status tried to give you advice. And most likely, if they're giving you advice, it's because they think that you need to learn something, that you're reluctant about something. And I want you to think about when you got that piece of advice, how was it delivered? What tone or what attitude? How did the person convey that advice? Were they trusting of you and your decisions? Were they a little bit more forceful and demanding and very direct? Did they provide reasoning? Were they kind and supportive? Think about a time that you received a piece of advice. For me, one that I can think of was about a month ago. My husband and I had plans to travel on spring break. And about a month ago, my mom called, and she opened with a very kind of trusting and kind and supporting attitude. And she said, you know, Emily, I know you're a smart girl. You'll make the right decisions. I know that you are 40 years old. You can decide what you do. And then she went right into being very forceful and direct and providing a lot of reasoning for why we should not go on vacation. We did end up canceling our vacation, but per the government regulations, not my mother. But I think that that's a really good way to think about it. My mom, and I love her, she forgot how pigheaded and stubborn I am, and that her reasoning didn't necessarily match my values, beliefs, and needs. And so when you're thinking about advice that you might get or give someone, you've got to think about the audience and what do they want? What do they need to hear? And how can you craft that message so they're more likely to believe you and to ultimately follow your advice? Since this is units 8 and 9, I'm assuming you already know quite a bit about the rhetorical situation. Whether your teacher uses something like Space Cat or Soapstone or a particular scholar, the rhetorical situation still has a few key elements that are the same for each. The first is the message, and that's basically the subject matter of the piece of the text. The next is the exigence, and that's really what is inspiring, stimulating, or provoking the writer to construct this piece. The purpose is pretty simple. It's what do they hope to accomplish or achieve? But they might have more than one purpose, so just remember that moving forward. We also have the audience, where the writer has to think about what is a need, belief, or value, or even a background of that particular audience, so they might capitalize on that in their text. The context There we go. The context is the time, the place, or the occasion in which the text is being written. And sometimes that ends up being really helpful if the writer can think about what is happening around the individual to whom they're writing this piece that might strengthen or can kind of bolster their position. And then lastly, maybe the easiest for us is thinking about the writer or the speaker and their perceptions of all of these things is what governs the text. So let's start by looking at the prompt. Again, a few of you might have joined a little earlier and I asked you to open the link in the description of the YouTube video where you'll find the prompt and the passage. We'll be looking at that today. But if you want to go ahead and pull that up, I will read the prompt to you. It says, in the following letter, Abigail Adams, 1744 to 1818, writes to her son, John Quincy Adams, who is traveling abroad with his father, John Adams, the United States diplomat, and later the country's second president. Read the letter carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Adams makes to convey her argument about the value of experience. All right, so we just reviewed the rhetorical situation. And one tip I would give you is that when it comes to the rhetorical analysis prompt, they give you a lot of the rhetorical situation in the prompt. It's just a matter of whether or not you can identify that. Take about a minute and think about where do you see each of those components or elements of the rhetorical situation embedded within the prompt. Some, like in the following letter, Abigail Adams, clearly that's the writer. Some will be easier than others. Some might be a bit of a stretch. Take about a minute and see if you can identify where you see exigence, purpose, audience, context, writer, and message in this particular prompt. Let's take about a minute and I'll wait for you. About 30 more seconds. All right, so here are the answers. If you were going through and kind of marking up a passage, you would maybe have noticed that it would look like this if you were annotating it. We have our writer, we have our audience is John Quincy, the exigence, he's traveling abroad. The context is a bit of a stretch. You'll get more about the context when we start to look at the letter. But you might see, you again had to make the case, the context is his father is a United States diplomat and the country's second president, and later the country's second president. Her purpose is given to us a little bit in the prompt to convey her argument. So we know that that's the purpose. She's trying to convey her argument. And then the message tells us a little about what that argument might be. It's kind of vague. It just says the value of experience. If you had to summarize the rhetorical situation and describe it in a sentence or two, it might look something like this. Abigail Adams, a mother, wants her son, John Quincy Adams, who is on a journey abroad, to understand her views on the value of experience. She crafts a letter to her son in order to convey this position and convince him to believe it as well. So again, if we wanted to annotate it, it might look something like this. You'll see we don't have the context there because it just didn't fit in, but that it's essentially capturing all of those elements. It's good. It's vague, but it's good. If anything, you might say it's kind of like an adequate reading, an adequate understanding, but that still is pretty good considering you've not even read the passage yet. All right, so what I'm going to ask for you to do today, is we're going to read and study the passage and specific lines from the passage with the hopes that we can revise this good, adequate description of the rhetorical situation, but make it more complex. So then in the coming days, when we're working with evidence and writing sample body paragraphs, writing that commentary, we're able to connect it to a more nuanced understanding of the rhetorical situation. So keep these in mind as we're making our way through the letter. And I'm going to ask for you to read the letter itself. Some of you maybe have read it before. For some of you, this might be the first time that you've read it. But at this point in the year, regardless of your exposure to it, you need to be able to do a very quick read of it. So I'm only going to give you 5 minutes. In that 5 minutes, I assume you'll just do a very quick skim of the text. First, just trying to understand literally what is she saying, and you might want to take notes in the margins about that. Feel free to make a copy of the document. That might be helpful for you too. But the main task is, as you're reading, anytime you see anything that speaks to her son's values, beliefs, or needs, underline it. Anything you see that references what she values or believes, underline that. You see any reference to the purpose, the message, the context, or the exigence, any of those elements, underline it, because then we'll do a close study of some of those key lines. Okay, you guys have 5 minutes. I'm going to sit here awkwardly and reread the letter myself, but I'll come back in about 5 minutes and we'll start digesting some of those annotations that you put on the passage, some of those key lines that you think really reveal at least something about one aspect of the rhetorical situation. All right, I'll see you guys in about 5. Take about 3 more minutes. And again, as you're reading, make sure you're underlining anything that you think speaks to the rhetorical situation, because that's what we'll be studying in about 3 minutes. Take about 30 more seconds, and then we'll look at some annotations. All right, let's go and get started. It's a tough piece, right? What I always tell my students when they encounter a text that they are struggling with, and maybe for some of you didn't struggle, but if you do find a text that you struggle with, I think a really great tip is to just underline a few key pieces and do a close study of those. And then that will usually tell you what you need to know. So instead of feeling overwhelmed by this whole letter, you only focus on just a small piece of it and you kind of break it down word by word. That will help you understand the piece in a much larger sense as well. So I'm going to share my annotations with you and walk you through how I see them reflecting something of the rhetorical situation. I'm sure you've heard from English teachers for years and years and years that the opening of anything is always going to be important, whether it's a novel or a book or a poem or a short story. And this letter is no exception. This letter opens with a really strong appeal to her son. She demonstrates a lot of knowledge about her son and his needs. You'll see I've given you on the screen, you'll see I've given you my annotations, but I've color coded them for you. So when you see something in purple, like the word repent, to me, that tells us something about her son, something about what he values or what he believes. You see something in kind of like that burnt orange color, that will reflect something about our writer, Abigail Adams. And then you'll see I have a bracket that's kind of like in a goldenrod color, and that will tell us something about the exigence. Take about 1 more minute, and I want you to look at some of those key lines and do a close study of them. Look at what does this say about the audience, or what does this say about the writer, or what does this tell me about why she's writing the exigence. Take about a minute, and then I'll kind of walk you through how I see them speaking to those things. All right, let's start with some of the beginning. She opens by saying, I hope you have had no occasion, either from your enemies or the dangers of the sea, to repent your second voyage to France. In this case, repent means to regret or to have remorse. And she says, if I had thought that your reluctance arose from proper deliberation or like thoughtful consideration, or that you were capable of judging what was most for your own benefit, like that's a backhanded compliment from a mom. Like, if I thought that you were able to know what was best for you, I should have not urged you to accompany your father and brother when you appeared so averse to the voyage. So when she uses repent and reluctance in a verse, we learn that maybe he entered into this journey or this voyage with some, at least reluctance, some hesitation. He was not excited to go on this trip. So those words help us know quite a bit about John Quincy Adams and how he was feeling. And then she says, I should not have urged you to accompany your father if I had thought that these things had happened. Meaning this like mother knows best kind of attitude, that she wouldn't have urged him if she thought that he had seriously deliberated these things. That also tells us that she was kind of pushing him. She was the one who was encouraging him to go. She does follow up though by saying, you, however, readily submitted to my advice, and I hope you will never occasion yourself, nor give me reason to lament it or to regret it. So she is telling us that he did listen to her, but he accepted her advice. So going back to that first paragraph, the exigence is telling us a lot about why she's writing. Again, this is not a, hey son, here's what's going on around the colony right now. Instead, she knows that she needs to respond to some of the anxieties and the insecurities that he's feeling. She knows that he was reluctant. So we're learning more already about the rhetorical situation than what we had in that previous 2-sentence description. All right, let's look at one more thing really quickly. So we could summarize it by saying she encouraged him to go. He was hesitant, but he still trusted his mother and went anyway, and that she's writing to kind of address those reluctancies. Okay, so now let's move to the middle of the letter. It's at the top right column. She gives us this great metaphor about a river that you'll talk about, I think, on Monday. She gives us some great allusions. And then she gets to this portion at the top of your paper toward the second, or the top of the second column. And she tells us a lot about the message, the purpose, and the context. Again, take about a minute or so to do what we just did. Do a close reading of some of those lines, asking yourself, what does this tell me about the message? What does this say about the purpose? Why is she writing? What is she hoping to accomplish? And then look in the second half of this excerpt and think, what does this tell me about what was happening on the voyage or what he was seeing? Again, take about a minute and think about how these things, these lines, these annotations speak to those elements, those assigned elements of the rhetorical situation. All right, so let me walk you through some ways you might interpret this. You might have focused just on one or two of these annotations. You might not have time to look at all. So I'll kind of give you the background, the cheat sheet of these, if you will. All right, so first, she starts by saying the habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. And all history will convince you of this, those difficulties of this fact, and that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure. Basically, she starts with, they're the habits of vigorous minds are formed in contending with difficulties. Like, it's okay to contend with difficulties. It's okay to face challenges because you'll have a vigorous mind. Your mind will develop and grow because of that. Which is all history will convince you of this, that wisdom and penetration are the fruit of experience, not the lessons of retirement and leisure, which I'm finding myself doing a lot during this e-learning time, a lot of retirement and a lot of leisure. But she's saying, if you are to grow, if you are to have a more expanded mind, that's going to come from experience. It's going to come from seeing things, facing those challenges, not from just being lazy and sitting around, those lessons of retirement and leisure. Because great necessities call out great virtues. That those virtues themselves are kind of brought to the forefront when you experience these challenges, and that otherwise they might have laid dormant. And she says that when you go through these challenges, they wake into life and form the character of the hero and the statesman, which is interesting because it's starting to say to us that this isn't just about John Quincy going abroad with his father and his brother and having a good old time, but they're trying to kind of tailor and craft him and build him into a hero and statesman, and that these traits might not be developed had he just stayed at home. The second half of this excerpted piece says, war, tyranny, and desolation are the scourges of the Almighty and not be deprecated. So she's saying, like, basically, while you're out there, you're seeing instances of war and tyranny and destruction. And that those are not great. Those are not something that should be celebrated or praised. But then she comes back and says, but it is your lot, my son, to be an eyewitness of these calamities. And then she basically goes on to say that you're able to have more perspective and that you can learn from your forefathers, your existence among a people who have made a glorious defense of their invaded liberties. And then the very last line, that you will transmit this inheritance to ages yet unborn. It's kind of his duty, his patriotic duty, to learn from these experiences, think about how that has shaped him and how it will shape future generations. And then ultimately his purpose is to be an eyewitness to this and help facilitate this change. So you can maybe summarize that this section is telling us the following about the rhetorical situation. Challenges are good, experiences to have. They bring out noteworthy traits, especially for a politician, a hero or a statesman. And that contextually, while he's abroad, he's seen instances of war, tyranny, and desolation, and possibly from a different perspective than what he would have seen at home. So that the purpose is not just about to convey her argument, it's to highlight the fact that when you experience these war, tyrannical, and desolate experiences, it's your duty to share that with others. All right, so if the beginning of a passage is important, then you can assume that the end of the passage is also important. So let's look at the last two paragraphs. Again, take about a minute to break down some of these lines and ask yourself, what does it say about the writer, the audience, or the purpose? Take about a minute. All right, this is probably my favorite part of the whole letter. Maybe it's because I find that it's just such a great way to end it. That she tells a lot about herself, and you probably are seeing a shift that you'll see more of that burnt orange annotation toward the end, which again, I find fascinating as an English teacher. That she says, consider the least of your incitements that you have a parent who has taken so large and active a share in this contest. So be thankful that I'm here and that I care about you and that I'm invested in what happens to you. And discharge the trust reposed in him with so much satisfaction as to be honored with the important embassy, which at present calls him abroad. So that she's putting trust in him. She knows that he will be okay. And that she also recognizes, which I think is pretty strategic of her, the honor that he has been asked to accompany the embassy. So she kind of floats his ego a little bit. I think that this is a great opening to the second paragraph, the final paragraph. She says, the strict and inviolable regard you have ever paid to truth. Again, another compliment. What she's basically saying here is that you've always been committed to the truth. You've always valued the truth. And that gives her pleasing hopes that is something that makes her happy, that she really admires about her son. And it gives her hope that you will not swerve from her dictates, you'll not swerve from the truth, you'll stay committed to it, but that you'll also add justice, fortitude, and every manly virtue which can adorn a good citizen. Do honor your country and render your parents supremely happy, particularly, this is mother's guilt here, particularly your ever affectionate mother. So basically then she's saying, stay true to yourself, honor the truth, but also learn justice, fortitude, and any manly virtue. And we're learning more about the purpose, where before it wasn't just about understanding what her argument is, but she's starting to kind of shift into this notion of these are the traits you need to be a good citizen, to honor your country, and to render your parents happy. That there are three things that she hopes that he accomplishes on this trip, and that it will render his parents supremely happy. especially your affectionate or loving mother. So if we were to step back and look at what we just did, oh, sorry, there we go. If we were to step back and look at what we just did, you'll notice that the letter itself shifts and moves in terms of the rhetorical situation. So it opens with a lot about the audience, a little about the writer. Then after she's kind of established that trust with her son, that's when she can kind of go in a little bit more thickly with the context, the message, and the purpose. And then she ends with some more of the purpose, but also a little bit about how she is feeling, her values, beliefs, and needs. It's a really interesting way to structure it. So just to do a quick debrief of what we've done and how you can apply it to other prompts that you might see in an AP class or possibly on the AP exam. We first started by identifying elements of the rhetorical situation in the prompt. It kind of gave us like a SparkNotes version, like a summary of the rhetorical situation. So we identified those things. Then we looked for those in the text itself by underlining some key elements that spoke to those elements of the rhetorical situation. Then together, you and I, we did a close reading of those lines with the idea of trying to have a more complex understanding of that rhetorical situation. It's a lot more than just she's trying to convey her argument about the value of experience, that we try to deepen it and become more nuanced in our reading of the passage, that we aren't using those sweeping generalizations. So let's go back to the original description, which you have here. It sounds pretty vague and generic now. Now you can see those sweeping generalizations. Things like, to understand her view on the value of experience doesn't really tell us much, or especially not as much as we know now about what she's arguing about experience. We know a lot more about John Quincy Adams than just he's on a journey abroad. We've learned more about how he's feeling. We also know more about how Abigail Adams is feeling. She's more than just a mother writing to her son. And then we can, again, as you kind of make your way through that second sentence, we can understand more about how she's conveying this position and trying to convince him as well. All right, so this is your homework. This is your task. I want you to take this generic statement that's full of sweeping generalizations and reflect a more complex, nuanced understanding of the rhetorical situation. You can make a copy of this. The link is in the description for the YouTube video, so you can pull it up. I'd encourage you to make a copy. I think I saw 400 emails requesting access. Just make a copy of it and revise it or yourself. But some of you might find that it's too tough to change someone else's writing. I'd rather just rewrite it myself. That's fine as well. So you can revise, like maybe you would say Abigail Adams, and you might replace that appositive, a mother, with something that's more specific. You can revise as is, or you can craft, but I'd encourage you to keep it just to a sentence or two. Keep it pretty brief. Then this will be the basis for our next 4 lessons, and we'll keep going back to it. So I hope you tune in over the next 4 days to learn more about how can we take this and turn it into an essay ultimately to make you a stronger reader and writer. All right, so thanks for watching. I hope I'll see you tomorrow. Make sure you complete that practice problem, either revising or crafting from scratch. And then tomorrow, we'll start tomorrow's lesson by reviewing some samples and talking about which one demonstrates a better, more complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. All right, good to see you guys. Thanks for coming. See you tomorrow.